Hey everybody, it's Carissa from Bad at Keeping Secrets. Today I have Maggie Smith, the poet. Do you like being introduced as Maggie Smith, the poet? And because I do feel like I introduced you to my mother-in-law as Maggie Smith, and she was like, "What?"
The Dame is coming on the podcast. Yeah, I usually am like, no, I'm not that one. I'm the other one. I'm happy to correct people and like deflate their balloon.
Oh, I am actually, my balloon is inflated that I get to talk to you. I mean, I'm sure Maggie Smith, the other Maggie Smith, is doing interesting things too, but I'm really excited. I feel like I have to go back to this thing of like what got everybody through the pandemic, this idea, I think that poetry and art, that would get us through this really intense time that intense hurt that we're going through. And I feel like, so your new book, you can make this place beautiful. Sorry, I'm holding it up in sort of a cheesy way, but is just that. It's not, I don't think it was intended to be a safe haven or a place that could examine what reality looked like during this time. But also the transformation process of coming home to oneself. Also, taking joy in not joy necessarily in what you have, but coming to terms with what life is and acceptance. I feel like it was a big theme for me in reading the book. But I like to kind of start out with how people got into, or the direction that your life took, in terms of frequently in the book you talk about not being able to pinpoint what exactly happened that started. The sort of book is about you going through the pandemic, about you breaking up with your long-term partner, about you getting comfortable in your and confident that what you were doing was work and was important. But I guess I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about your origin story, or how you knew you wanted to be a poet. Or
Yeah, I sort of joke, although it's true, that I became a writer because it's the only thing I've ever been any good at.
I was just
You
gonna
know,
mention that most people, when I teach art, it's like you kind of recommend, like, you do art if it's the only thing you can do, or the only thing you want to do, because you can't do anything else.
right, because I mean it's not certainly like poetry as a career path is certainly not the sensible option. So I really do think I got to a point where I was like, I don't know what else I would possibly do with my life. It feels like the way I can do the most good, and it's the thing I do that makes me feel most like myself. Like I never feel as much like me as when I'm putting pen to paper, which is probably like, maybe that's strange, I don't know, but that's like how I feel most like myself. And maybe because I've been doing it since I was a teenager. I mean, I wrote my first poem when I was in 8th grade. So now that I've been doing it this long, I mean, it's been more than 30 years of writing poems, not every day, but as often as they show up, and I'm always glad to welcome them. And it's just, if I didn't do it for a job, and I feel like I'm very lucky now that writing is like my primary source of income. For many, many years, it was not. In fact, it was like a cost. I was definitely a cost rather than a source of income. I would be doing it anyway. Like I would be writing all the time, even if I had to give somebody $20 every time I sat down to do it, because I love it that much.
Did either of your parents, or in your lineage, or adults around you, have the same sort of inclination to write?
No, I come from a family of math people. So, and I nearly failed algebra. So I'm sort of an anomaly in my family to this day. Like no one can kind of figure out like, how did Maggie turn out like that? But when my sisters were out playing soccer, I was in my room with, a Cure cassette and a legal pad and a Papermate pen. It was a very inexpensive pastime. But no, I mean, nobody in my family sort of was creative at work really, or in their free time. That was not a thing in my house.
I think it seems though it seems beautiful, the luxury of being able to know what your passion is or what makes you feel whole, I guess is so maybe the wrong way to say that.
Yeah.
And be able to follow that. I think for me, I'm kind of torn in multiple directions, so it's difficult to know which one exactly to follow. This makes me think about Susan Cain's recent book, Bittersweet, when she talks about
Yeah.
the reason of going through hard things is not necessarily to come out better, but it's to make art and meaning from life. And I feel like that really resonated when I read your book. Can we talk a little bit? So in the beginning, you talk about Good Bones, and
Mm.
for people who aren't familiar with Good Bones and its virality and the circumstances around when it came out, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, Good Bones is a poem I wrote in 2015 in a coffee shop in my neighborhood in about 20 minutes, and like threw it in with all my other poems. But the life that it's had has not been the life that any other poem I've ever written has had. So it's gotten I feel like that poem has sort of like made it to the big leagues, and I have a lot of other poems I like a lot that are still like sitting on the bench of the farm team.
Mhm.
um, but in 2016, the week that the poem was published online, it was the same week as the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, and the same week in England where Jo Cox, who was a member of parliament and the mother of young kids, was killed. And this was sort of in the middle of Brexit madness there. And so the poem went viral. And quite literally overnight, I went from being a poet in Central Ohio with two little kids and a couple of books, but a pretty small writing life. Poetry has a pretty small discerning audience. It's mostly other poets. Um, to like literally the next day having people read this poem that I never thought would read this poem. And so it's sort of, I call it a disaster barometer now. So if people have read it, the odds are they have read it on the internet after something terrible has happened. Because whenever there's a school shooting, whenever there's a disastrous election result, whenever there's a natural disaster, anytime there's a significant tragedy, all tragedies are significant. Whenever there's a tragedy, somehow I notice that my social media mentions start picking up and people are sharing Good Bones in the wake of that. And so it's a strange thing to sort of have the your readership growing and sort of becoming more well known and being able to like lean into your creative life more, being directly related to people sharing your work in response to terrible things happening in the world.
It is interesting, but it seems really also potentially satisfying that within the pain there's solace, and that the offering that you've given, people are finding that within it, if that makes sense.
It does. And that's what I'm coming around to. But I'll be honest, it's taken me a long time to get to a place where I'm not sort of pained to see it making the rounds again. Because, of course, when it makes the rounds again, if it were any other poem under any other circumstances, my response would be, oh, how cool, people are reading and sharing my work. But under those circumstances, the response can never be how cool, people are sharing and reading my work. It has to be, oh my gosh, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
What happened? So that has been the sort of knee-jerk reaction to seeing my work in the world, is trying to tether and trace the breadcrumb back to whatever terrible thing I need to know about that I might not know about yet. And so getting to a place where I can realize that people are sharing the poem because it acknowledges the sort of terrible of the world, but also acknowledges the potential for beauty and restoration. That's something that I'm like, it's taken me years to get to that place.
I was thinking about maybe if you could talk a little bit about the transition from being, we touched on it a little bit, that writing, you would do writing as a cost, to like the sort of not fame of having a viral poem, or but a different sense of notoriety and validation that sort of happened from before and after that moment in your head.
Yeah, I mean it, and at first it was really in my head because being known, like knownness doesn't actually keep the lights on in your home. And being known doesn't pay your mortgage. So there's a kind of currency to being known that is not always monetary, which I think some people don't realize. But it did for me, I think it was kind of an invitation, this poem going viral. It was very surprising. And it was kind of an invitation for me in my life to lean into my writing life in a way that I hadn't been. I'd always been writing. I knew I'd always write, but I was primarily, taking care of two kids. I think my youngest at the time was 3, and was in daycare twice a week, but I was pretty much a stay-at-home / part-time work at home parent. And I thought of myself at that time much more as a caregiver than as a writer, because I spent many more hours of the day on one kind of task than I did on the other. And suddenly I realized, oh my gosh, this is maybe the way that I'm able to do more with this. It kind of like cut a path for me that I just never thought would be possible. And it did open up a lot of new opportunities for me to travel, to go to literary festivals, to give readings, things that would not have happened without that poem becoming so well known.
So there's a bit, I think, that you talk about in the book, about children, about your children being a mother not being enough, and how to tell your children. And I ask this question selfishly for someone who, as someone who has a child, but also has a creative practice. And I feel like that's not exactly the right question. Like that question, all that can come from that question is pain and
Yeah.
not enoughness in either arena. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the conflict of motherhood and with creative practices.
It is. I love that you said not enoughness. That's probably exactly the way I would phrase it. Because if you're really sort of like hip deep or neck deep in your creative practice, and you're on a roll and you're spending a lot of time, or maybe you're on the road a lot, or you've got a book deadline and you feel like you're leaning in really heavily into that, it feels so good because you're doing sort of like what you feel like you were put on earth to do. And yet probably some of the caregiving is being sacrificed because you're not spending 100% of your time taking care of your kids and being, there, waiting on them hand and foot. And then on the other hand, if you are in a period of time, either because they're young or just for whatever reason, that you're spending a lot of time on caregiving, then you sort of look over and there's your creative practice kind of side-eyeing you from across the room, like, when are you going to get back to me? And so there's really no way. I mean, you might even argue that about not only about child care, but about other kinds of relationships, like what happens in a marriage when you're spending a lot of time on your art. What happens in a marriage when you're spending a lot of time on your kids. There are only so many hours in the day and only so much energy that we have. And so how do we kind of like give little doses of ourselves to these pieces of our lives that feel particularly important without the guilt and or shame of feeling like no matter what we're doing, we're not doing a good enough job at any one of those tasks on, the grand pie chart of life.
Uh, I think recently in my own life, I've been exploring the connections between guilt and depression. And
Mm,
as a person who I think feels a lot of guilt, for me, I really relate to the term guilt and less shame. I feel less shame, but more guilt. Uh,
yeah.
and I think about sort of how both of these, hearing you talk about this, how both of these sort of anxieties of not being enough for your children, and then also not doing enough for your creative career, and then also not doing enough for your marriage. How did kind of, and then also wanting to be true to yourself, how did you go about, I think I know the answer to this question, managing all of those expectations?
I'm like, do tell me the answer because I'm not sure I know the
This
answer
is
to
what
that question.
I'm gonna see if I can guess what I think. Keep running. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the answer, but I think that's what, tell me if I'm wrong, you go back to.
Yeah. I mean, I think in part what at least on the sort of creative, like I hate to put these things like as pitted against each other because I don't think they are. Like I don't think it's art v motherhood. Like I never want to think of it that way. It's not, it isn't that. And I think if we think about it in terms of like time, it sometimes feels that way. Like I could be doing X or I could be doing Y. I could be building this up or I could be building them up. And it always feels like they're in somehow in competition, but putting things you love against each other, no one wins. Like no one wins. And so I think what I finally realized was it's important for me to have my kids know that I love other things and that there are other things that fill me up. And I also think it's a burden if you are a child or a spouse or a daughter or a friend to feel like you are the sole reason that person wakes up in the morning. So, on one hand, it's great to shower your children and your spouse and your friends and your students with love. But if they feel like they're the ones making you happy and your happiness is completely dependent on them, I actually don't think that's a gift. I think that's a burden. I think as a child, which I still am, you know, I have parents. I would feel absolutely burdened by the idea that they have to talk to me every day, have to see me every day, that that's the thing that keeps them going. I want them to have friends, hobbies. I want them to travel. I want them to have their own lives. I don't live with them anymore. You know, these kids are not always going to live in my house. They're going to leave. And can you imagine leaving your house and thinking, well, now my mother is going to collapse because the only thing that makes her happy, that's been keeping her going and occupying 100% of her time and energy has been us. And now what? And so it's always been important to me, both for my daughter and my son, to show them that they're more important than everything. I say I love you more than poems to them all the time. Like they know I love them more than poems. If a train was coming and it was my kids and poems, I'm not saving the poems. Um, but I also, it's important for them to know that that's a really big part of my life and it fills me up in ways that nothing else does. And that when I miss them like crazy when I travel for work, but I'm not miserable the whole time because I'm also doing something I love and I think serving a purpose that's important.
I was wondering if you could kind of, there's a place in the book. Um, I think I'm going to use that. By the way, the line, I love you more than poems. Um, because I think that I had dated people in the past where I felt like I would never compare to their form of art or form of
Yeah.
expression, always second. And I remember thinking that that was such a horrible feeling. And I don't ever want my Margaret to feel that way. I also think after reading this book, your love and protective instinct for them really shows through, and your will to take care of them and figure out what the, not the best way to do that, but kind of the best way to do that is.
Yeah, my best way anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something I think towards the beginning of the book that you said, and I might misquote it, but it's something about anger is not something you're holding. Anger is something that held you. And I thought that this was a really profound statement and sort of re-examination on how emotions work and what
Mm.
control we have over them. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about anger.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me in a different way of in Irish. You don't say I am sad or I am angry. The phrasing is like the sadness is on me, the anger is on me. So it's a kind of presence that is not of you. So you're not claiming it as part of your identity or something that you're actually sort of like traveling with. It's something that's, it feels more temporary that way, I think.
Oh
Something is
yeah.
on me. Yeah, like a jacket. Like I'm just going to take this anger off. I like that. I came to sort of my idea through um, reading about Buddhism, actually, and this idea that um, that anger is something not that you're holding on to, but it's something that actually possesses you. You are the possession. It's holding you. And I remember thinking at that time in my life, what I want most of all is to be free and to be at peace. And the anger is not serving either of those things. And in fact, if I am in it, if it's possessing me, that is the opposite of being free. Like I can't actually get free and be this angry. So I'm going to have to find a way to crawl outside of it and separate myself from it and be more at peace with some of the things that have angered me most that have happened in my life. And in a lot of ways, writing You Could Make This Place Beautiful was part of that process for me. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't necessarily healing or cathartic in any of the ways we all hope. I think that making art can and will be in sort of a best case scenario, but it did help me think so deeply about these different parts of my life and contextualize things that if I hadn't sat down and really thought of my adult life in this broad way, I don't think I would have seen the connections and the echoes and the ways that things touched. And that for me helped me sort of crawl out from inside that feeling of anger and get to a place of maybe not quite forgiveness. I thought I might get there. Spoiler alert, I did not. But I did get to a place of greater acceptance. And that to me feels a little different from forgiveness. I think I got to a place where I'm like, I lived a human life. I'm living a human life. And these are things that happen in human lives. And I can't change it. And it doesn't make any sense. And it's not serving me to go over and over and over and over this stuff in my mind because it's not going to change. And there's no amount of thinking or feeling I can do that will have any impact on the past. So just kind of keeping perspective for me has been the most useful.
Well, I think this sort of leads into, I think, a theme. Again, correct me if I'm misinterpreting this. Uh, Throughout the book is a tell-all or a trying to locate the truth, but in contrast, you have this idea of you as the curator, as
Mm.
you as the truth not never being able to be found or located, as there's a multiplicity of truths existing simultaneously. Can you talk a little bit about your choices on kind of holding both of those things at the same time?
Yeah, I knew when going into writing this book that it wasn't going to be the definitive version of the story. I mean, that's the trick, I think, is that there are objective facts, like these things happened. This conversation occurred. I found X and Y. Um, there are facts that are not that cannot be disputed. They're just facts, but there aren't really objective truths because even if we all had a shared experience and then left that shared experience and were asked to write 500 words on what just happened, none of us would describe in 500 words everything exactly the same. Somebody would pick up something. Everybody would feel differently about it. There's not really a way, even if you're writing a memoir, to write a book that tells, quote, the whole truth, because you don't have access to the whole truth. You only have access to your perspective of what happened to you. But because there's no omniscient narrator, although I bemoan that fact, I really wish I had an omniscient narrator who could tell me in sort of like soothing, maybe Morgan Freeman or Ron Howard voiceover, everything about my life, so that I would have all of the answers and there would be no secrets, because I would know everything, because there's a narrator who has access to all of that. I don't have access to all of that. I'll never get all of the answers to what happened to my marriage, or certain things that happened in my past, or my career. We just don't ever get access to all of that. So we can only deal with the sort of narrow aperture of our own experience and try to approach it, I think, with as much integrity and empathy as possible. And also, I think, a healthy dose of realism and not needing to be the hero. Even if we are the protagonist in our own story, which we damn well should be. I think we need to let go of needing to be the hero or the good guy in our own story. I mean, that seems like a dangerous place to need to create from, of being like right and good. It's also just not very interesting needing to create from that place, I think.
I think, like, I don't know if you felt the cultural shift in permission to sort of look at one's shortcomings maybe in the last 10 years. And maybe it's a product of getting older myself, or within the sort of the cultural consciousness. I don't know how you feel about that term, that there's sort of this trend towards holding the difficult parts of your body or of emotions or who you are with not reverence, but the ability to accept them and come to terms with them in a less judgmental way. Did you feel that kind of before writing the book? And then was the process of writing the book a little bit like, were you able to kind of let go of those maybe self-judgments that you had?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm a firstborn daughter, so I have like very strong perfectionistic and sort of like control impulses. But I'm also Midwestern, and my entire ethos and sense of humor are about self-deprecation. So I don't think it's hard for me necessarily to admit when I'm wrong, or like look at the hard parts of myself. I think the shift in writing this book is being so public about it. Like, it's not hard for me to be like, well, I'm perfectionistic, I can be controlling, I am a bad sleeper, I hate when people are late. Like, I know all the things about myself. I'm very sarcastic. Sometimes that's not appropriate given the situation. I think, the memoir writing is sort of a crash course in courage and vulnerability, in that if you're willing to share the sort of worst of yourself with not just the people closest to you, but frankly, anyone willing to read your book, that's a different thing. And I do agree with you. I think we're leaning into that more. People talk about being in therapy now, and I don't feel like 15 years ago, everybody would have been like, oh, I'm in therapy and my therapist tells me all the time that I need to do X, Y, and Z. I think there would have been more, I mean, I don't know if shame is the word, but or even just being self-conscious about your own imperfections or brokenness. And now it does seem, and I think, maybe post-pandemic, even though we're not post-pandemic, post like heightened pandemic, post-lockdown pandemic, I think mental health conversations are so much more common to have, even with casual acquaintances. And I think one of the sort of beautiful byproducts of going through hell with everyone else on this planet is that we can talk to almost strangers about really personal things, because some of that hardship was shared.
Yeah. I think there's a lot this kind of goes into throughout the book. You have notes on foreshadowing and things that you may, upon reflection, have known or been able to predict had you had an awareness of them. Can you talk a little bit about that process of re-examining, for example, in Good Bones, how your children were the focus of it, but someone, what also was left out was also saying something incredibly important at that time?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I'm a pretty savvy consumer of culture. So if I'm watching a movie, I usually know where it's going. If I'm reading a book, like unless it's structured in a completely novel way, I usually am like, oh, I bet this is going to happen. I think most of us, especially if we were English majors, are like trained to be analyzing things as we consume them. And yet life doesn't work that way. I think we all have, or I'll just speak for myself. I know I had huge blind spots in my own experience where if I were my life as a book or watching it as a small independent, low budget independent film, I would have been like, oh girl, this is not going to be, that poem going viral is not going to be good for your marriage. This is going to cause some stresses at home. Or I would have been like, oh, him coming home with that new car without telling you he was buying a new car. Yeah, that's like midlife crisis red flag from like the handbook. But when you're living your life
Couldn't happen to
and you're
you.
emotionally, yeah, I know. I mean, it couldn't happen to you, right? When you're living your life, you just don't see things unfolding as plot points until you get a little bit of hindsight. And then you look back, for example, when writing a memoir, and you think, oh, now I see where some of these things started to go off the rails. And maybe even there was a quiet voice inside of me, if I had been listening, that even knew some of those things then. But it's very easy not to listen to that quiet inner voice when it starts to tell you something you don't want to hear. It's very easy to be like, you know what, that's probably wrong. I'm going to continue as programmed. It's much easier to listen to the inner voice when it's cheering you on and telling you a bunch of good things that you would love to know.
Or convenient things. I mean,
Uh-huh.
it's inconvenient to have to work on something that isn't coming naturally. I think about this in some ways. You could make this place beautiful. For me, I met my partner in art school, and he has a job as an architect, like a regular 9 to 5 job. We get our really good health insurance from him. But it has been really problematic when good things have happened for me in my artistic career. And do you think it's possible when two people have I think both of us have these kernels that really want to be artists,
Mm-hmm.
or inner child that really want to be seen in that light. And one person, do you think it's possible to really celebrate the one person who is closest to you who's getting that chance?
I hope so. I mean, I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think it's hard. I think it's hard if it's your spouse. I think it's hard if it's your best friend. I mean, so many of my friends are writers. And like when the person gets the Guggenheim, you are so happy for them. And hopefully the feeling you're having is not like, why wasn't it me? Because in my case, it's I didn't apply. But not
But still,
that
why
I would
wasn't
have
it
gotten
you?
it, but still, but I think it's hard. I mean, I do think it's hard. I think ideally we would treat the people we love in our life the way we treat our children. Like when my kids have wins, I'm never like, that could have been me out on the soccer field, or that could have been me getting into the art show. Like, I think we want every good thing for them. We want there to be no limits. We want them to pass us by, nothing they do or succeed at is threatening to us. Nothing they do or succeed at hurts us or chafes us or makes us think we're not doing enough with our lives. We never think about our kids succeeding like, oh, I can't believe the kind of life they get to have, and look at the life I have to have going to my 9 to 5, or like, who does she think she is? We never think this about children, and yet we might have that uncharitable thought about our artist friend or artist spouse. And so, is it possible? I think it is, but I think it requires a lot of work, a lot of inner work to be confident enough in what you're doing, and also confident enough in like the sort of long arc of things. Like, we're all playing the long game. If you're an artist, you're playing the long game. If something doesn't happen for you this year, it's not that it's never going to happen. I tell myself all the time, it's just not my time, or that wasn't for me. Or maybe that door not opening leaves space for something else to come that I would not have been able to do if this opportunity had happened. And my experience tells me that that's true. Oftentimes losing can be the biggest win, because it gives you more time to crack into something else that maybe you wouldn't have had the time or space to do.
I love this. I feel like this interview for me could be called Maggie Smith's Comforting Thoughts. um,
I'm here for it.
but
I'll send you an invoice.
Thinking about, you could. I think about that. When I think about this, there's also another selfish question I have to ask of you, even though we only have a few more minutes. You say in the book something about airing your dirty laundry and what its use would be for other people. And I think that this is something I think a lot about with my own practice. And I think, like, for example, when I wrote about having to terminate a pregnancy 2 years ago, no one else was mad at me except for my mother-in-law, in that it was just not something she wanted people to know about. I think in her defense, I think she really wanted, it made her feel like it was not enough that she was supporting me, that I needed to invite like an internet community. But for me, it was really therapeutic on so many levels. I like had to write about it. If I didn't write about it, I would succumb to really deep sadness that I don't know if I could have gone through without other people who had actually been through the actual experience. But
I get that.
All of this being said, can you talk a little bit about the process of deciding what you want to share and what you don't want to share, and what the value in sharing is?
For me, it's been a really strange thing, publishing this book, because I realize I now have there's sort of like an asymmetrical amount of vulnerability and disclosure. So I might meet someone at a book festival and they come up and they're like, "Oh, I read your book. I loved it." And I my first thought before even "thank you" or "that's lovely" is, this person now knows a lot of things about me and I know nothing about them. Like, I don't even know their name maybe. And they have like now seen into some of like the most private nooks and crannies of my life. And I did that to myself. But that asymmetry is incredibly strange still to me, of I'm sharing more with others than necessarily I'm getting in return. And what does that look like? Value-wise, I absolutely understand something you just said about wanting to sort of share with other people, lest you sort of like implode, frankly. And for me, this memoir was the book I had to write in order to write other books. I didn't know how to write something else. It would have been honestly kind of like letting me off the hook if I had just written something else instead of writing this book. But this book was like a giant armoire parked in front of a door. And I could not get out of the room I was pacing in circles in my own mind without getting it out of the way. And so I really wrote the book more for me. The value of writing the book was for me, like that deep processing and the ability to sort of confront an experience and give it a form. I found, as a poet especially, I found that incredibly helpful to find an organic form for what all of this experience, which has been amorphous in my mind, to give it a concrete form was incredibly helpful. And some of those conversations that I was replaying in my mind, once I put them in the book, they kind of, that like movie stopped playing on repeat because it had a place to live. Yeah, it had a place to live. And so now the value for me is that I got to do it, and I moved the armoire, and now I'm out of that room. And sometimes I still visit it if I'm being honest, but I'm not stuck in it anymore. So I'm able to work on other things. But also, and I know you get this all the time, just having people say they feel seen or understood or less alone in their difficult experience because of something you made about your own experience, is such a gift. It really is. It feels like I'm getting back tenfold what I offered, which hardly seems fair, but I'll take it.
Oh, I mean, I think fairness is a tricky topic that we could tackle another day. I want to, because we only have a couple more minutes left, I kind of want you to talk about, bring us full circle with sort of the title of the book and the relationship to the poem Good Bones, and then also the relationship for the title as sort of a call to action.
Yeah, I played with a couple different titles for this book, and ultimately I landed on the last sentence of my poem, Good Bones, You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And in part, I thought, I have such an ambivalent relationship with that poem. I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if people found the poem through this book? Not because of a school shooting, not because we cannot enact somehow adequate gun control in this country, not because of some terrible thing happening that may or may not have been preventable if we were sensible about anything here, but because they came to this book and found that poem. And so I wanted, in some way, it was about reclaiming that piece of work for myself and taking it out of the context of the internet and bad things happening, and it being a sort of like disaster bat signal that goes up every time something goes wrong. And the call to action is really just like, I think it's about taking ownership over your own life and not waiting to be rescued, not waiting for someone else to fix it, not thinking that your partner can make you feel whole, not thinking that that kind of stability is the be all end all, but like, what does it look like if you really came home to yourself and took ownership for your own life and your own choices and had to make your life from scratch by yourself, which I found myself in my, mid 40s having to do. And so that's the kind of like hopeful piece, I think, of the title, is not only you could, but can and will.
That I think I'm going to misquote you. Life is a series of choices, and everything was possible. Or I feel like I should have asked you to say that.
No, you're right. You're right. I think it's life like a poem is a series of choices. Yeah, and we have to make the best ones we know how with the information we have at the time.
That is my life mantra at the moment, uh, for everything.
Yep.
Because otherwise there's so much dwelling in the past, and also so much like fear of uncertainty in the future. And for me, I take a lot of comfort in that line. Thank you, Maggie. I don't know if you know, I mean, I don't know if anyone can ever conceive of how much their work has had an impact. Also, it was an amazingly beautiful read, but also I feel like it has direct, I feel like not through your mistakes or through your understandings or through your hopes, making my life, having more autonomy over my life and the decisions I can make and the routes that I can take towards wholeness. So thank you, Maggie, for doing this, and thank you for meeting with me today. And also, I'm going to put a link to, is it okay if I put a link to the final poem in the book?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And I'll link your Substack and links to get the book. But yeah, no, this is beautiful. And I'm very excited to see what you do next, but no pressure.
Thank you so much.
Take care.